because we love the way they run it. But they were so busy this evening that we had to run with this ourselves. So as you can see, our talent is not tech, but here we are. Thank you so much for being with us. My name is Nicole Alifanti. I am the president and one of the founders of CURE, the Coalition for Understanding Racism Through Education. We are a 501c3 volunteer organization here in Larchmont, Mamaroneck, and we strive to educate our neighbors about the structures and implications of systemic racism in our country's institutions as a critical part of dismantling racism. We believe that a deep knowledge of the roots of racism plants seeds in the minds and hearts of blossoming activists, accomplices, and anti-racists who will take action in dismantling racism. We continue to learn that this is a deep, lifelong work, and we are proud to be learning alongside our neighbors. For tonight's event, we are going back to school in unprecedented times, a global pandemic, historic flooding, political polarization, and racial reckoning. So tonight we'll engage in an interactive dialogue about how we can work together to foster schools that teach truth, that support healing and well-being, and that prepare our children for a multicultural society. CURE has an all-star panel, and I do say that, an all-star panel of educational researchers, advocates, and practitioners here this evening to help us make sense of the challenges and opportunities schools are facing. We'll learn how districts can work with communities to build a culture of belonging for all students, faculty, and parents, and how culturally responsive sustaining framework is the foundation for that culture. I would like to introduce Ann LoBue. She'll be moderating this evening. Ann is board chair of CURE and past president of the Mamaroneck School Board. She is a doctoral student at Teachers College, Columbia University, where she is also a graduate fellow of the Gordon Institute for Urban and Minority Education and a policy analyst for the Center of Educational Equity. Ann, take it away, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for that wonderful introduction. And you're going to quickly see that I am the least expert on this group, and I can't wait to get in conversation with them. So our format for tonight is as follows. After I introduce the panelists, we'll start by asking each panelist a question related to their role and expertise in education, and then follow that up with a conversation among the group. We've set aside the last half hour for questions from you, our audience. So please think up some questions and ask your questions using either the Q&A box or put them in the chat. Now I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. Dr. Dawn Brooks DeCosta is an award-winning educator who has served as principal of Thurgood Marshall Academy Lower School for the past 10 years. Before that, she spent 16 years as a teacher in Harlem. Dawn earned her doctorate in educational leadership from Teachers College, Columbia University. Her dissertation research focused on social emotional learning and culturally responsive school leadership. April Frances Taylor is Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity at the Eastern Suffolk Board of Cooperative Educational Services and has served as a teacher, building, and district administrator on Long Island and in Westchester. As an advocate for equity, she has served on New York State's Culturally Responsive and Sustaining Framework Stakeholder Committee and Civic Readiness Task Force, and as Vice President of the New York State Council of the Social Studies. April earned multiple degrees in education leadership from Hofstra University. Alprentice McCutchen is a history teacher at New Rochelle High School. He has spent a good portion of his 25-year professional career developing curricula that integrate hip-hop, Socratic inquiry, debate, international travel and study trips, student action, performance-based assessments, project-based learning, and critical writing as part of his work to develop students who will contribute to the thinking world. Alprentice is also an assistant imam, as well as a doctoral student at the CUNY Graduate Center's Urban Education Program. Dr. Rosa Rivera McCutchen is Associate Professor of Leadership Studies at CUNY Lehman College. An educator for over 20 years, she began her career as a high school teacher in the Bronx before earning her doctorate in teaching and learning at New York University. Her research has appeared in numerous academic journals, and her new book, Radical Care, Leading for Justice in Urban Schools, was published by Teachers College Press in July. Dr. Jountel White is an executive strategist who supports nonprofit, corporate, and philanthropic organizations to deepen their social impact. She provides guidance on fueling race, gender equity through their work and fostering a diverse, inclusive culture on their teams. Jountel's expertise includes leading strategy for racial equity-focused programs and advocacy campaigns in a variety of sectors, including education, housing, and civil rights. Jountel earned her PhD from Columbia University. Natalie McCabe Zwerger is Executive Director of Recenter Race and Equity in Education, where she leads a team of practice leaders, consultants, and co-conspirators who work nationally to ensure systems operate against embedded racial injustice, white supremacy, and persistent inequity. A longtime educator, attorney, and advocate, she has fought for equity, racial justice, and liberatory education. Her expertise includes elevating critical consciousness, dismantling systems of oppression in educational settings, and centering Black and Brown youth and youth from historically excluded identities in teaching and learning. Welcome, everyone. I'll start the questions tonight with Jountel. Jountel, recently, it feels like the polarization of the US political system has spread to public education. Can you tell us about the current controversies over critical race theory in K-12 schools and over equity and diversity issues more broadly? Is this something new, or is there a history here?
Can you hear me? Awesome. I love panels that just, dive right in from the beginning. So thank you for this awesome question, Ann, and kicking it off in this way. Before I respond, I do want to thank you and the CURE team for inviting me to be a part of this truly amazing panel of educators and administrators and folks just doing dope stuff in the space. So I'm glad to be part and really looking forward to the discussion tonight. So to this question, which I'll kind of summarize the root of really how did we get here? What are the pieces that are relevant to this particular conversation around CRSE, but also in terms of thinking about equity and inclusion in education specifically. It is something that I consistently grapple in my own work as a scholar of American politics, looking at how it informs our policy decisions, especially within the education space. And to that question, the short of it is certainly we are not looking at something new when we think about the debates around critical race theory, around inclusion of critical race curriculum within schools. I think for this discussion, things I want to name kind of take us back or sort of historicize it to provide the contextual, the context necessary to understand sort of where this is drawn out of. And I want to talk about that in sort of three temporal phases, if you will. If we start off sort of the origins of our K-12 school system, thinking about the civil rights movement, and then sort of contemporarily, right? And so really grounding it in the origins of our K-12 school system, really being by design as a privilege and not a right, and truly a privilege for the wealthy, the able-bodied, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, male, right? And so that being by design, whose schools were targeted for and for whom. And so that was sort of the impetus around our school system, really being specific and exclusive to this particular group. So the common school era around the 1800s is when we really get to see the beginnings of our school system as we know it in terms of the structure and design being paid for out of taxpayer dollars, that sort of structure that is very much common to today. We do see, again, Anglo-Saxon, white, Protestant, but also at that time, female, right? And so that's still specific, that it was really marginalized, exclusive to white folks and Anglo-Saxon white folks, and not to folks of color, not to people with disabilities, so it's really, I want that to kind of be a grounding for us to understand the beginnings of our educational structure. And so that is persistent. And I have to name that, our school system comes to be formed at a time where slavery is legally sanctioned. So the capture and enslavement of Black people are legal. There are laws banning the immigration of Asian Americans. There is the forced removal and land capture of indigenous peoples in this nation. There is a thriving, just years after we get our first public schools, a very thriving campaign of kill the Indian, save the man explicitly. So to think about across various groups of color, their educational experience, their marginalization experience don't happen in silos from what is being taught and experienced in the K-12 setting. So I want to name that this is our US society at the time that schools are formed. So I want to name who was in schools and the type of learning that is happening in schools. It is not in a bubble that these things, these policies are being passed and students are just going to school, right? Happily learning. But I want to name that there's an intersection there, right? So while we have Anglo-Saxon white students in school, the type of curriculum that they are learning is also echoing and mirroring the social contours of the day. So when you have legally sanctioned slavery, when you have legally sanctioned the removal and capture of indigenous peoples on their lands, the types of education that students are receiving validate these things. They validate and they teach white supremacy, a superiority, a biological superiority to other groups to really justify their experiences. And so that is endemic to our curricular system and has been since the beginning. Okay, so I wanted to jump to the second stage, which is really the civil rights era, as I will call it, because as I will just name, not as I would call it. In terms of this period, right, is widely known, and it's important for us today in the 21st century. That's often, the pivotal point where we said that there was racial progress happening within our US as a whole, but especially within education when we think about desegregation orders, right, in Brown v. Board. So to think about that from a curricular standpoint, we have bodies that look different, melanin tones and skin colors of students who begin to have access to some degree, at least legally on paper. We know that the story of desegregation is much more complex and it did not happen as it should have with fidelity, but that's a whole other discussion. But to think about, yes, from a physical aspect, integration happened, from a curricular, yet and still, that level of integration did not happen. So what you have is the persistence of a very Eurocentric way of teaching, pedagogy, and curriculum. And I didn't name in terms of the common school the types of things. So when you think about scientific racism in your literacy and numeracy classes, right, the really very egregious and explicit racist tones about people of color, about non-white groups, are very common in social studies and English when I'm learning my numbers in terms of the earlier grades. And so by the civil rights period, what we have is that is removed. The most egregious stereotypes are removed, but the same Eurocentric teaching of history and all other courses remain, right? And so what you have is this persistence. Yet and still, there is advocacy. Make schools more inclusive for all students. Make schools more inclusive for all students. There are by the 1970s, almost half of US states have established some sort of what becomes known as multicultural education policy. But yet and still, these are not often enforced or funded. And so they become more perfunctory, symbolic types of policies that are established. And in our K-12 school system, I'll jump to today. Since that period, truly, we haven't had the level of curricular reform that was set out and envisioned of the 60s to really have a school system that is segregated, not only physically, but also within the culture and climate of schools. And so to Ann's question around the CRT debate, which is really rooted in this question of, do we tell the full truth about the US? Do we feel comfortable in naming, right, the history of our nation and really identifying and speaking to who is in our nation, who is American, who makes up the diversity of our student population, right? And so it is this debate that is common from the beginning of our K-12 school system, because by design, it was never designed for anyone other than, right, white Anglo-Saxon males. And even when there was expressed, right, acceptance of others, it was not then enforced or holistic. And so when we begin this conversation, it's important to name that backdrop upon which we sit. because it remains a persistent gap in our education system, and why CRSE is important as a framework, but even more important as implementation, because as we all know, a thing can be grand in vision, just like desegregation, but when it is not enforced or implemented, we come back to this conversation of how it can be. And so I want to name that and look forward to the rest of our discussion.
Well, thank you for that, Jountel. That was an incredible context. You covered it all, and I'm so glad that you started us off tonight. I listened to a panel earlier today, and the scholar said that when we think about changing education, we have to think about the 3 S's. One is don't oversimplify, it's complicated. The second one was stay the course. And the third one is fix systems, don't add programs. So that speaks to kind of the deep, deep work that we're talking about here tonight. So I turn now to April. My question for April is, okay, so one thing we know for sure is that critical race theory is not taught in K-12 schools. But what we want to talk about tonight is what is going on in K-12 schools. So New York has adopted a culturally responsive sustaining education framework. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is, why it was developed, and how it benefits students?
Yes, definitely. So I want to echo Jountel's expressions about this panel. I'm so happy that I was invited today and be able to share with the group tonight and really highlight the importance and the journey that New York State Education Department has had around DEI and culturally responsive education. So just leaning into my middle school teacher techniques, I am going to share some slides just to help folks to visualize some of what we're speaking about. And I will also put a link to the document so that in their own time, people would be able to look this information over. So let me just get my, okay. Here, okay. So Jountel, it made it so easy. I don't even have to go over all of those pieces about CRT, so thank you. So the framework and, oh, now I'm sharing the wrong thing, my apologies. So diversity, equity, inclusion, and culturally responsive sustaining education framework, right? State Education Department came out with a call of action in April of 2021, encouraging all districts to adopt a DEI policy framework. And that was their why. In that document, they talked about their why, which I'll share. And then they also had a partner document, the Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework, which actually came out in 2018 as the what and the how. So just to give a little basis of it, as I said, that the call of action document, this was April 2021, and then they have an official one that was released in May 2021. But it really brings everybody together on what these definitions are around education. So it says that diversity includes all of these aspects of the identity markers of what make people who they are, right? And those pieces going to the idea of lived experiences, their experience within our society has some type of, these identity markers have impacted them in some way. And inclusion is ensuring that we are including all voices, specifically those who have been marginalized in the past. And equity, as we know, is looking for or working towards fair treatment and access, and eliminating the barriers that Jountel spoke about that our education system have had over the histories. Now we're trying to eliminate those barriers so that we can get to true equality. So we have to, understand that our systems have impacted in a negative way marginalized groups of people, specifically our students of color, particularly Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students, males with low academic performance, students of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, our LGBTQ plus identifying students, and students with disabilities, right? And there have been, as stated before, blocks and barriers that have been put in place, and we're working towards removing that. But at the same time, we have to be cognizant that many of our school districts do not have a large student of color population, right? So 68% of students in New York counties are 70% or more white. And with that knowledge, it's still important for us to understand that culturally responsive education is for all of our students, and understanding DEI is for all students. The lack of exposure to diverse people lends itself to bias and leaves students ill-equipped to reach their full potential. Research has shown that the 2 of the top 5 reasons students drop out of college are lack of cultural capital and lack of knowledge of college. So when they go away to school and they are around those who might bring some type of differences to them, it becomes very anxiety filled, and many of them come back home and they want to go to a local school because they're back in the area that's very homogeneous to them, right? So by not recognizing the importance of cultural responsiveness for all of our students, we are doing a disservice to them as they grow to become citizens within our nation here. So we have to understand that, you know, the main reason for these frameworks is to help us move from this idea of inequities to really justice. So I thought this was a great diagram. You can see on the first picture of inequality, the tree is bent. There are more apples on one side, there are less apples on the other. When we talk about equality, both children are giving a ladder, but it's still, there's inequities. So inequity is giving a higher ladder to that other child, and so that they have a chance to still pick the fruit, but we still notice that the tree is bent and that there's still less fruit on the other side. So really justice and removing those barriers is fixing the tree, the system, right? And ensuring that there's growth on both sides. And so that's what these frameworks are really trying to help us get to for all of our students. So this, Natalie probably will recognize this. This is a slide that I've used based on my learnings from NYU's Metro Center, where I began to become a culturally responsive educator many years ago in my first district. But the idea that culturally responsive sustaining framework is not another initiative, right? It's to add to a plate. It is the plate. All of these things are part of what we do when we are culturally responsive to the students in front of us, whether that's bringing in diversity because they lack it within their school, or whether that's ensuring that they see themselves in their curriculum because oftentimes it wasn't there before. So I just want to give an overview of how the framework is set up. So those who are interested in looking at it and seeing how districts can adopt it and use it to move forward, I'm just going to give, you know, the different pieces that make up the framework. One major part of it has beautiful pictures. On page 10, it gives like the crux of what this is. It says that culturally responsive sustaining education is grounded in a cultural view of learning and human development in which multiple expressions of diversity, which includes all of these identity markers, are recognized and regarded as assets for teaching and learning. It shares these 3 concepts, and a big part of these 3 concepts is self-reflection is required to dismantle systems of bias and inequities. And we want to value our students, we want to value our families, and we want to value the culture that they bring. Another piece is the idea that we want to teach the students in front of us, and encourage cultural pluralism rather than assimilation. And they say that we can do this by aligning with these 4 principles. Principle 1 is creating a welcoming and affirming environment. Principle 2 is fostering high expectations and rigorous instruction. Principle 3 is identifying inclusive curriculum and assessment. And principle 4 is engaging in ongoing professional learning and support. So what we're doing tonight would be an example of principle number 4. And then the framework says, how can various stakeholder groups of education ensure to implement these 4 principles? And so it breaks it down to each stakeholder group, and it's a couple of pages for each group. And for our families and community members here, there's a specific area for them, higher ed, district leaders. So it's very inclusive of all stakeholders in our school communities. And then when you look further, it gives a plethora of bullets and says, this is what it looks like for teachers who are creating a welcoming and affirming environment. And what teachers can do is say, okay, what does this bullet say? Am I doing it well? Am I approaching it? Or have I never thought about this? And because I never thought about it, how do I set it as a goal to move me further, to be more culturally responsive? And finally, the big piece is action planning, right? So after you're doing this learning together, how are districts planning to move forward? And as I shared before, this paradigm shift of becoming cognizant of DEI and becoming more culturally responsive for all students, not just the marginalized. Every student that's in our school, we need to be responsive to. And these are just some examples of districts in the region who have created board policies, equity plans, who are now moving that work forward. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I hope that has helped to answer that question for you, Ann.
Thank you so much, April. I'm sure we'll have some follow-ups from you, but now I'd like to go to Natalie. Natalie, I'm wondering from your perspective, can you walk us through how a district might approach implementing this CRSE framework? What should they do first, and what should the top priorities be? Another question we have is, what kind of structures should the district put in place to support the work?
Thank you so much for that question, Anne, and thank you for having me as a part of this truly brilliant group of folks talking about the work. Just so y'all know how I enter this conversation, I'm a white Puerto Rican cis-hetero non-disabled person with significant class privilege, and I'm coming to you tonight from Wappinger, Pagonic, and Pagosset land. And that is just important for me to name as an acknowledgement of where my learning is taking place and where the learning in this conversation is taking place as well. To your question, the first thing a district can do is avoid the temptation to think that their efforts will begin and end with professional learning. Professional learning is a piece of it, right? And you having worked at the NYU Metro Center and being a part of a team that worked to co-author that CRSE framework that April brilliantly walked us through, we knew from the beginning that it would have to take more of a system-wide approach, and that the ask would have to be of all stakeholders who have contact and influence on the young people that we serve, including students themselves, right? To understand what accountability in community looks like when we're talking about the work of advancing equity and racial justice. And so if your district is coming in just at the professional development level, you already have missed opportunities. This work and the research tells us that it has to involve leadership. And I think this is sort of an answer to your second question at the same time. This work cannot live in one dynamic and committed leader or small group of leadership. You have to build within the fabric of the system work and structures that are sustainable enough so that you could take out the superintendent, take out the current members of the Board of Education, remove all the principals, and still have efforts that would be a part of how the district and each building and each office in the district operate. And so thinking about those structures, there have to be ways of engagement for all of those folks to question some of the historical pieces that we've already named this evening, how who they are impacts how they move throughout whatever their role is. And then what the ask is, if we're going to apply this lens of becoming more racially equitable, more culturally responsive, what changes do they concretely make within their roles? Because far too often professional learning drops us off at the place of saying we're going to shift mindset, which is deeply important, and I don't want to diminish that, but we can't wait until every single mindset is shifted for our young people. They're waiting for the education to which they are entitled. And so if we are going to give them that, then it's a question of how do I, in policy, in practice, in curricular shifts, actually make those types of changes that will change the trajectory of how a young person moves through spaces in each of our school buildings. And so thinking about, who is this work for? It's for young people. It's particularly for young people from historically excluded groups. It's particularly for Black and Brown youth, to think very concretely about the ways that we can twist how we center Blackness, Latinidad, how we center a spectrum of gender and sexuality, a spectrum of ability, how we are responsive to histories and legacies of the deep historical entanglements of race and socioeconomics that got us to the place that Dr. White told us we are in this moment, right, because of that deep history. And so this means school board members have to question how who they are impacts their gatekeeping and decision-making power, how they are moving funding, how they are supporting hiring decisions, how they are connecting or not with specific members of their community. One thing I often ask board members is, who do you connect with the most? And who do you connect with the least? And that's the heart of thinking about cultural responsiveness, right? It's to who you are most responsive, but also to who you are least responsive, and then honing in specifically on what that has to do with the biases that you hold. So working with Board of Education members, starting with district leadership, with school administrators, build a shared language, sit with that framework, walk through those definitions that April gave to us to really ask, how are we embodying these definitions here within our district? And then, of course, this work can't happen without centering youth and community. And so what are the opportunities for young people who are hungry to be nourished by a complex conversation about race and identity? They're watching all of us, right? They're watching particularly in classrooms where there is no conversation about race and identity, because that in and of itself is a conversation. It's a statement, right? It's a position taken by an educator who is seeking to avoid that discomfort that we may need to lean into in order to think about, for example, how I, as a white educator, teach a history of enslavement differently by knowing that I enter the classroom embodying the enslaver. That is the connection to my own ancestry. And so if I'm not aware of that, if I don't question the way that I teach through that lens, then I've missed an opportunity, right? How are we partnering with youth to be the driving force, to think about how they can change the world that we live in so that we're not dealing with the type of polarization that we have talked about at the start of this conversation? How are we having parents, caregivers, and community members at the table with us making decisions about how our school buildings could be more responsive, welcoming, and affirming? That's the language that we used in the state framework, is to ask those questions where community members can show up and be their full and whole selves, and then the spaces where they cannot. And how I, as a member of that community, am responsible for those spaces. So what are the moves that I can make, right? For those educators in and out of the classroom, for those staff members to think about how they teach, engage, and relate to young people, that means not just a conversation about what I teach and how I teach it. It means that I'm also doing reflection on the way that I interpret student behavior, on the way that I think about relationships I have with young people and where bias may be at play. I'm taking a deeper look. A lot of districts are doing equity audits, which is a great component to add to your racial equity efforts. However, those findings have to first be public and transparent. And you have to make sure that your analysis isn't inviting you into a space of deficitizing youth and community. So a district will have to use that hyper-focused lens from an abundance perspective to say, back to the image of that tree, how is the system not serving young people in the ways that it must? And that's a different question than let's explain our racial disparities and how we got here. So the types of questioning that a district does, set by leadership, going to be hugely important in terms of the trajectory of how deep this work goes. So when you have districts that have developed those DEI policies, those equity policies, policies that support transgender, non-binary youth, the question becomes, how has that changed folks moving throughout their daily work of the district? How does that change the way a young person moves in the district? Is there any impact of those policies? Or do they just sit on board docs collecting dust, right? That's really the question. And I say this, not to be flippant, but to really hold each of us accountable. And so it's a call out, particularly to the white folks on this call, for the spaces that you influence, to really ask what reckoning has happened for you in this moment since the murder of George Floyd. Since the day before the murder of George Floyd, you've got the lawn sign that says Black Lives Matter. And how are how am I holding myself accountable? If a district could follow that type of a model, then a district would actually get to the level of depth that would serve our students in the ways that that CRSE framework was intended. If I take you through the points of the definition of culturally responsive and sustaining education that are in that document: affirming the racial, linguistic, and cultural identities of youth, elevating independent learning and rigor. So this isn't a separate conversation about academics, right? Academics is absolutely a part of this work. Connecting across lines of difference, empowering marginalized and historically excluded voices, all in furtherance of what might be the most important piece, is honoring students as agents of institutional and social change. A district could spend a long time unpacking those 5 factors, but my greatest advice to them would be, how do you do that from all of the angles throughout your system? So that it's not just a question of how do we send X number of folks to a particular professional development. It's a question of how have we engaged everyone who has an impact on the trajectory of a young person's learning in this space in some deep analysis, but then also held them to account to shift practices as a result of what they have learned. And I think that the deepest thing to acknowledge is that this work is uncomfortable. This work is not for white people to feel satisfied or to feel a benefit from. This work is to regain some of our humanity as white folks who have been a part of and continue to be a part of the dehumanization of Black and Brown people. And so it should feel heavy, right? It should be difficult work. It should be lifelong work. And I think if districts fully understand the breadth of that and can sit with that, then they might get to the place that they hope to in terms of hearing back from youth, but particularly youth from historically excluded groups, that something has changed as a result of these efforts.
Wow, I just want to sit with that for a minute. That was so deep and so important, Natalie. Thank you so much. I'm turning now to Rosa, who works with educational leaders. And I wanted to ask you, where do leaders who want to build a culturally responsive and sustaining school community start? How do you teach people to put this together as an educator of school leaders?
Yeah, first, again, echoing what others have said, really a privilege to be in the presence of this brilliant panel of practitioners, researchers, thinkers, and really activists, right? Because I think of this work as being engaged. And really appreciate the prior comments that have led to this point where I'm talking about preparing school leaders. So much of, I want to start by first talking about the role of higher education, right? Because I think that we start very often with some assumptions about the sort of enlightened state of higher education, and that higher education folks, the faculty, who are teaching our future leaders, who are teaching our future educators, actually get this themselves. I think it's really critical that the CRSE framework that New York State adopted does include the role of higher education, but my own experience in my own institution and just being in conversation with other folks across institutions is that somehow we sort of skip over that part, the responsibility of the higher education institutions to do our own work and to do our own sort of reflecting and to do our own analysis of what we're doing, the ways that we are contributing to the same inequities that we're sort of looking at the K-12 systems and saying, well, finally they get to step up to the plate because, there's a framework for this. But really, I think the first step is sort of a reflection, right? An examination of the work that we're doing and how are we complicit in perpetuating these same narratives of deficit, as opposed to really understanding how the system is failing our children, our communities, the kids' communities, the families, how the system is doing that. And certainly the role that I play in perpetuating the inequities just by virtue of the curriculum that I advance at the higher ed level, right? So when aspiring educators come to me at Lehman, and I think other really good places that folks have been doing this good work around, really are trying to sort of to disrupt the way we do our own practice, right? So so much of what folks have said is such a critical part of the practice that I have to adopt as someone who is working with aspiring leaders. And very often to undo some of the work, these folks have been in schools, they're practitioners, they're teachers, they've been working in schools for years, 5, 10, 15 years. And a lot of the work that they have to do when they come into my program is, or into really any aspiring leader program, what it should be is to begin to examine how their practice has perpetuated these inequities, to really think about, as Jountel started us off with, is really examining the history, right? Like who were schools designed for originally, and how have schools either evolved or failed to evolve to really truly meet the needs of all of the students and the communities that we're serving, right? And very often, I know that at least in our community, I live in New Rochelle, very often there's this sort of, in a lot of places, there's a sort of a narrative around the good old days, right? And that narrative is so dangerous, and in a lot of ways racist, because it's a complete erasure of what the experiences of education has been like for many of the folks that have passed through an educational system, right? So my work as someone who is helping folks to think about becoming leaders and to disrupt sort of the ways that they've been practicing is to engage them in a lot of the stuff that folks have already been talking about, right? So to really be thinking about what does it mean to be an anti-racist, right? What does it mean to be an anti-racist and to engage in anti-racist practices for white folks, right? And what does it mean to engage in anti-racist practices as a person of color, right? As someone who's a person of color who's grown up in this society, who has sort of internalized a lot of deficit and harmful narratives, I know that I also need to reflect and think about how that sort of gets manifested in my practice, right? So that's sort of the first work. And a lot of this is based on, some of the research and what I think about and call radical care. So really engaging in the practices of, okay, Al, we see you with the shirt on. Just as a FYI, I told him not to wear the shirt, but he's a proud spouse, so I appreciate that. So, this notion of anti-racist practices and adopting that anti-racist stance, that's really critical, and that's critical for all of us, right? And that's again, all of this stuff is sort of embedded in what I think of as radical care, and as well as in culturally responsive and sustaining education, right? Engaging and developing authentic relationships, right? Really deeply authentic relationships. So part of what we're talking about is not just, so the educational space of the four walls of the school, but really truly engaging and going outside of the school and engaging with the community, right? How are you understanding what the community needs are if you're not engaging in conversation with the community? Very often, as I said, there's a lot of historical trauma that comes with schooling, with all institutions, but in particular with schooling, right? So I work in the Bronx. A lot of the families have attended the very same schools that their kids attend, even if it's not the same school by name, it's the same school building. And they have experienced marginalization, they've experienced trauma at the hands of folks who have been in that very same building. So we need, as school leaders, part of my work then is to prepare folks and tell them that you need to understand that community. And folks have to go out on community walks and engage in a process of understanding what that community, what are the opportunities in the communities and what are the challenges, and really being very careful to think about how those challenges are not related to the people in the community, but more so to the systems in the community, right? That have been oppressive to community members, right? Engaging in those practices. Having a sense of, as Natalie said, the conversations around like this, the cultural and anti-racist work is not separate from the conversation around standards and academics and achievement, right? And I don't mean standards in a way of like, here is the standard and you've got to meet that. I'm talking about academic rigor, right? April said CRSE is the full plate. All of those things need to be on that plate, and the academic piece is not necessarily something that's an add-on, that is separate, nor is the work that I'm talking about either. All of these things need to be part of the conversation as an integrated whole. And when we don't have those conversations, when we don't do that, part of my work as someone who's training aspiring leaders is to have them interrogate how those practices get taken apart and aren't treated sort of as the whole, right? That's part of it. The other piece is really just activism, right? Engaging in this sort of loud and sometimes subversive, and very often I think the most effective leadership is subversive, but you can't do some of that leadership work where you're activating allies and engaging with communities unless you really develop those authentic relationships, right? People need to really know that you care about them as the school leader, that you care about the whole person, you care about satisfying the needs of the whole person and understanding their entire history. All of those things are really essential. That's the work that I do as someone who works with aspiring leaders. But I have to say, like, I think it's really critical that we don't give institutions of higher education a pass, right? Because there are far too many institutions of higher education that are perpetuating, that are reproducing these same inequities, because we are training teachers without sort of the critical analysis of, again, the history of schooling and who schooling was for, and the ways that schools have not really transformed in response to the needs of all children, not just sort of the richest and the whitest among us. That's essentially kind of in a nutshell what I do. And so I'm again, really thankful to be part of this conversation and to really build on the stuff that other folks have said.
Thank you, Rosa. Then thank you for bringing in the responsibility of higher education to prepare teachers and leaders for this world that we live in now, and the changes that we need to make. Dawn, I want to turn now to you. You're a longtime school principal. What do things look like in your school? How do you build a culture and a climate that is culturally responsive and sustaining for not only for your staff, but for your families and students?
So first, I want to say that I feel such deep gratitude to be here with you all. And it is not often that I can be on a panel and feel like I am learning more or as much as everyone participating. So I have such a deep gratitude for each of you, and am receiving everything that you are giving. Sometimes when you are on the ground working every day, you don't see the bigger picture. And so you all have really created that again for me today, because I am certainly, in the weeds, right? And especially now because of what we're living through and how this is so different right now. But I feel like I have a gift to be at Thurgood Marshall Academy Lower School, because the school was opened with a mission of cultural responsiveness and social justice. So what I don't have to deal with, which I know some people do, is the pushback against that work. And I do feel so fortunate that I work in a community that fully supports this work. And that means staff and parents and students. And that is how I think it is most successful, when everyone is working towards the same goal. And at the end of the day, it's because we love the children, right? If you really love them and you authentically believe in them, then you want the best for them. This is not a question whether you should teach them about themselves, or whether you should bring in texts or teach them about the joy of their identity. It's not a question, because if you love them and you know that they connect with the learning when they see themselves, then you want to do that, right? So at Thurgood Marshall, though, we make sure that we are definitely engaging our students in real world connected conversations. We have to be courageous. We talk about things that are happening. We give the students a platform to say how they feel about George Floyd, about Breonna Taylor, about Ahmaud Arbery, about everything that's been happening, about the Capitol riots, about political unrest. We give them a voice and an avenue and celebrate what they have to say and recognize that. Same thing with our staff and same thing with our families. We've made a conscious effort as well to make sure that our staff is diverse and representative of the children that they stand in front of, which I think is very important. Part of the mission of Thurgood Marshall Academy Lower School, which was the vision of Dr. Calvin Butts in Harlem, New York City, is that students see models of excellence that look like them. So as much as we are teaching about anti-oppression and injustice, we are also teaching them how beautiful they are and all of the contributions that they've made to society, because I believe that there needs to be a balance. For us, the work is fortunately joyful, like I was saying. And I know that the work is difficult for some people. But if, again, you believe in the children in front of you and you want the best for them, then this is not difficult. I mean, I don't think it is, right? But the work that I've done with my staff is definitely starting from a place of self-reflection. And it's very important that we interrogate what we believe about the students that are sitting in front of us, that we reflect back to our own childhood with our experiences with race, with our first experiences, how it impacted us, how it impacts what we believe about one another, and sort of confront that. Because if you don't do that self-reflective work, you will act in ways and not understand why you're doing certain things, right? So the self-reflective piece is really important. And I think that a part of this work, which I was so glad to hear Rosa talk about, is there is a self-care piece that has to happen when you're doing this kind of work. And Natalie also talked about how difficult it is. And so in that work as an educator, it's not easy work. So you also have to take care of yourself. Like you have to be able to take care of your heart and the trauma that you will experience yourself in delivering this to children, right? And so I think that that piece is sometimes left out because it can be very difficult work. But I also think it needs to be said that there is also joy that is not only difficult, that what happens with the children and the way that they see themselves and the way that they learn about one another and build a connectedness and a belonging is an absolutely beautiful thing to see. And it deepens and richens the learning. Teaching from multiple perspectives, teaching the students from historical perspectives, different perspectives is really important. Jountel talked about this one perspective that we've been learning all this time. And it's so important that now we have the ability to bring in different voices. I just will say that on the school level, the frameworks are wonderful to have, but teachers are not curriculum writers. And so what happens is on the school level, we are trying to scramble and find things to teach. And you can have a framework and not know what to do with it. And this is just what I've learned from other principals is that we might have the what, and I think that many of us are on board with the why, and it's the how that there is a piece missing. And like I did here earlier, going to a PD is not going to be enough. And going to, getting a framework is not going to be enough. It is like ongoing work, revising the curriculum, finding new things to use, multimedia things to use. And that by itself is like a whole project, along with like what Rosa was talking about, sort of supporting teachers who have not learned this way, and sort of having to reteach how we learn how to teach in real time when those little angels are sitting in front of you right now and they don't have time for you to figure out what you're doing. So I just say all of that to say that it is joyful, it is hard work. I'm so grateful for the framework that the state has created so that we can really begin to see the how. And I'm grateful for all the work that is happening on higher ed, because I feel like teachers are now being developed in such a different way than I was, and then, the teachers that I've previously had. But for us, it's a joy. I'll just say that. And that's how we feel about it at Thurgood Marshall.
Thank you for that so much, Dawn. It was so interesting to really take it into the school and find out how it works in schools. And I think that by ending with Al, we've actually come to the perfect place because he is a teacher. He's trying to do this in classrooms. And so I wanted to ask Al, what can teachers do to ensure that both their curriculum and their pedagogy is culturally responsive and sustaining?
Good evening, everyone. I want to extend the gratitude that was mentioned earlier by my co-panelists. And my gratitude comes as a learner here. I come to you all as a learner. I'm taking notes as you all are speaking, because the teacher is ever the learner first. So if I'm truly being honest, if I'm going to be in front of students, I have to recognize and be fully intentional that I'm a learner first, and I wear that cap, and I come with that lens right now. If I may share my screen and just maybe give just some visuals to a brief conversation that I'd like to have with you. So hopefully you can see my slides. Let me know if you can see that. Are we good? Okay, great. So once again, my name is Al McCutchen, and I'd like to answer that question. How can we as educators in the classroom ensure the culturally sustaining, culturally relevant, culturally engaging pedagogy is there and living within the classroom? I want to call this a curricular to career conversation. I want to call this an agency-based teaching and learning conversation. So Natalie talked about how are we going to develop these students as agents of change. It has to begin in the class. For me as an educator coming from that educational lens, it has to begin in the classroom. And when I look at where and how I could begin to ensure that process, it begins with starting to know who my students are and meet them where they are. And guess what? This is where they are right now. And they're on these devices. And when sometimes when we put up these shields in our classrooms and say, no, you can't come in here with those devices, we may want to rethink that, because those devices aren't going away. So how can we embrace these devices? How can we embrace this technology to make sure that we are now beginning the process, the long journey of reversing the reprogramming that 150 plus years of education and schooling has done? How can we begin to use this device to be in that process of inundating and now trying to reverse the program that has happened in our educational system in the 200 plus years of enslavement and the 300 plus years and 400 years of total segregation and degradation and dehumanization in our country? So I have to ask, when we talk about building agency in the classroom and building those agents of change, it begins with me as an educator on day one, on a hot summer day, on the early part of September, and not asking my students to take out their notebooks or take out their, and here's the grading policy, here's the book receipt forms and so on and so forth. No, it begins by me saying, take out those phones that you all have. I saw you in the hallway with them, so don't front. Take out those phones and let's now embrace the technology that we're going to be seeing and using all year. And I asked them these prompts, and I asked them, I asked them to write these things down. And individually, beginning with what I am good at is. It's a statement that I want them to complete, and I'll give them 90 seconds to 2 minutes to fulfill this statement. And it's something that they've never been asked for probably in a classroom on day one. But I want to begin the class day, week, and year with this tone. Then I asked them I asked them to write down what I love to do is. And I want them to fill it in. I want them to go unconscious respond. First thing that pops into their mind, I want unconscious responses. And then I asked them finally, and probably most importantly, what makes me happy is. If we're trying to ensure, going back to the question, if we're trying to ensure a culturally sustaining, culturally relevant curriculum pedagogy, it begins with knowing who my students are. And these prompts are an immediate gateway to find out who they are. And more importantly, for them to know who they are, for them to know what they're good at, for them to know what they love to do, and for them to know what makes them happy. And damn it, imagine getting paid well doing that. Build this in, to wake up on a Monday morning when it's February, when it's freezing outside, that you know you can go to a job or a career that you love to do, that you're good at, and that makes you happy, and you work around co-workers and peers that also make you happy as much as possible. What can help to ensure the curriculum and pedagogy is culturally sustaining and culturally relevant? I'm going to go to the agency via the critical pedagogy. So Paulo Freire gave us this idea that to know how to teach is to create possibilities for the construction and production of knowledge, to ensure that students are engaging in a culturally sustaining, culturally relevant, quote Latz and Billings, culturally relevant pedagogy and learning. We have to make it relevant for them. We have to give them the space to produce knowledge, not for me to stand in front of the classroom and in a didactic mode. And if the class is 44 minutes, I've spoken for 35 of those minutes, giving them maybe 2 to 3 minutes to ask questions. Not going to do it in today's time. It's not going to happen. It's not going to work. Not if we're truly trying to build agency-based teaching and learning and agents for change. And that's not going to happen. We have to create our classrooms and our classroom dynamics around opportunities for students to construct knowledge, deconstruct, as my co-panelists talked about, the myriad of opportunities that we need to deconstruct, and then produce knowledge. But knowledge that's centered around them. If I have students in my classroom who are brown and Black, who come from different parts of the Caribbean, who come from different parts of South America and Central America, and North America, meaning Mexico, or parts of the United States. If I have these students, as well as Europe and South and East Asia, if I have these students centered in my classroom, then how can I really look them in the face and really and spend several weeks or a disproportionate amount of time on European-centered topics, i.e. the French Revolution, if I know I have students in my class who are Haitian and they're going through some things right now in terms of the modern phenomena of that which is happening most recently in terms of Haiti. But we can also go back in terms of the phenomena that produced the current status of Haiti. So why would I spend so much time on the French Revolution when I have Haitian students staring me in my face? And we need to talk about the Haitian Revolution and what they're experiencing, not just in a social political realm, but a historical realm, and then bring them up to the speed in terms of constructing new knowledge and why these things exist, why Haiti is the way it is, as just one example of the people who are in my audience in my classroom. If I'm using my lesson planning mode, students must be able to, and that means when they're able to, that means that there's practice embedded in this. So students must be able to understand that people are oppressed. Going to Kinchler, one of Freire's disciples, the students are oppressed. We need to be able to talk about oppression in the class. Oppression based upon centuries of racial dynamic, centuries of class dynamic and gender dynamic and orientation dynamic. We need to be able to talk about the oppression based upon religion and physical disability, as was mentioned earlier, and as well as ageism. And I'm going to go back and really take a dive into religion, for example, because as a practicing Muslim, I want to bring this on. I'm going to touch upon a third rail that might spark a conversation, I'm hoping, but let's go there. So we just went through our 20th commemoration of 9/11. And as a practicing Muslim, when I hear the narratives of how we all came together during this time period, so on and so forth, well, guess what? I had just converted to Islam maybe a couple years prior to that. And once again, living in New York City at that time, I have anecdotal as well as now empirical evidence to show that no, we weren't all on the same page. We know of tons of people who resembled Muslims being attacked. Physically, emotionally, verbally attacked. It's empirical data. So this kind of narrative, once again, we have to be able to deconstruct and not be afraid to deconstruct these narratives that persist in our classrooms, in our districts, in our schools. And when we can do that, then we're beginning the process of engaging in culturally sustaining, culturally relevant pedagogy. We have to have an agency-based curriculum. An agency-based curriculum. I'm going to say plural because it's not just the social sciences, not just my history class. It has to be agency-based throughout math, throughout English and literature, throughout the sciences, throughout language and all types of language arts. And even in your physical education class, we have the opportunity to now look at which strands are measured more on the reader. So if I have an obligation to make sure my students pass these readings, that's another conversation for another day, and I can give you my politics, my full disclosures and disclaimers on what I feel about state mandate and high stakes testing that cater to a small percentage of students that really, by the way, no one ever looks at anyway, in terms of really measuring intellect and really measuring the longitudinal success. Well, I have to make sure I'm responsible for making sure they get there, to get out. So they have to do what they want to do and do what they have to do to do what they want to do. I also, if I'm creating an agency-based curriculum, I have to think about which content strands are most directly relevant or transformed to be made relevant to my audience, to our audiences, for my educators on the Zoom. I have to also, and this is a comprehensive way to look at curriculum, I have to think about which standard strands will be most needed as my students continue to matriculate into subsequent courses. I have to, and last but not least, I have to think about what are those content strands that can be leveraged towards authentic application opportunities they will need for real world experiences outside of the classroom. Hence the idea and the practice of curricula to career work. Whatever I do in my class, whatever we do in our class needs to be preparing our students for the larger world, period. If it's not, and then we wonder why students are asking that perennial question, why are we doing this? And we can't, with a straight face, give them a serious answer, then what are we doing? We're wasting their time. If we're not preparing via the curricula, via the pedagogy, and via our aesthetics, our classroom aesthetics, which I'll talk about in a second. So as I hope that's not the way, as we think more about this agency pedagogy, in terms of not just the curriculum, but now how it's applied in the class, are students in our classroom given the opportunity, and I mean continuous opportunity, not just an isolated kind of activity. I mean, that's the culture of the classroom to identify a problem, whether it be in a math class, science class, English class, social science class, history class, wherever. Identify a problem, research the problem, and and by the way, make that problem authentic to them. Give them that space to make this an authentic problem that's connected to the content, but also really diving into the nuances of the content that now make the students render the students visible within that content, to quote Ellison's work. So I need to render my students visible via the content, as problematic as it is, until we can change it a little bit further or even abolish it, to quote greater works. So I need to research this problem, develop collection plans of action around the problem. So my classroom needs to be a laboratory, not really a classroom. Let's change the language. The classroom needs to be a laboratory. We need to use that as language as such, where they're literally creating things and making mistakes and failing forward in these laboratory possibilities. And then they're going to implement these plans of action. So they're going to write letters in our classrooms to stakeholders, to primary, secondary, tertiary targets, if you will, in terms of social action 101. So our classrooms need to be a social action 101 with a backdrop of English, science, math, history, so on and so forth. Why is that? Because if we're not engaging our students in order to make them active citizens, and that means people who are engaged within the body politic, what are we doing? What are we doing? We're not supporting them and making sure that they can be viable, active, not passive, but active agents within the body politic. And of course, we're evaluating and assessing how they did and how we didn't, building efficacy along the way, building agency along the way, trial and error along the way. Sorry. And what this does, when the students see this, and the students see, and Rosa talked about this also, when students see us kind of in real time, wrestling with how we're going to try to comprehensively bring in the culturally relevant pedagogy, responsive pedagogy, and make sure that I'm responsible and make sure I get you to pass this test so you can get out of here to go and do greater things. When they see us and being super intentional about who my audience is and how I'm going to center you, because you're my audience, and I'm going to help unearth some of the things that have been hidden in the class, rendering you visible. When we're super intentional about that, when students feel reflected, and as Freire kind of mentioned earlier, they feel respected. He talks about why not discuss with the students the concrete reality of their lives. So how do we as educators in the classroom not shun the left field conversation or seemingly left field conversations, but how do we embrace them? And how do we now make connections that are seemingly left field to the actual content and to their lives and to the outside world, to beyond the classroom, beyond the district? Why not establish, as Freire goes on to mention, intimate connections between knowledge considered basic to any school curriculum and knowledge that is the fruit of the lived experience of these students as individuals? We need to make these connections and converge and with this curriculum, with this content, with the pedagogy, and with our knowledge of our students and stakeholders, their parents, all members of the community. Because what's happening now, and Jountel mentioned this in terms of her understanding and dissertation of the common school. We're still living in common school eras. Look at our classrooms. I mean, if you look at the image here, either we have rooms from the late 19th, early 20th century, or we're still doing the same thing. So what are we doing? How are we daring to engage students to become agents of their own learning, of their own critical possibilities, and there's no opportunity for them to actually engage one another. So we need to rethink the aesthetics of the classroom. How do we ensure culturally sustaining, culturally relevant teaching and learning? We begin to change the aesthetics of the classroom, become super intentional about that. We become to recognize, as the chart shows, that lecturing is not going to get it done. Students do not retain the material. So it has to be practiced by doing. Once again, our classrooms need to be called and actualized as laboratories. There needs to be space for that, and that needs to be the culture of the classroom, building, and districts moving forward. And when their students are collaborating like this with each other, and then moving to collaborate with other people from other groups, that's when we'll begin to ask those difficult questions. Now the difficult conversations have to come in the classroom. How do we build, how do we ensure culturally sustaining pedagogies and curricula? We have to have those different conversations. We have to make sure that we have the people in our classrooms and centered around the circle to make sure that we're all in this circle. There's a culture created that we can say what we need to say, agree, disagree, and learn to agree to disagree in order to prepare them for the larger world. How dare I not talk about the things that are happening within the body politic to students who are going to go out there in a matter of weeks, months, and years? How dare I do that? and teachers who refused to engage the larger body politic and issues that are going on there. How dare they? Quite frankly, how dare we just say to ourselves, I'm only here to teach math? No. Because within math, within those statistics are things that are going to actualize and illuminate racialized oppression, gendered oppression, class-based oppression, religious-based oppression, so on and so forth. So how dare we? Moving forward, we need to have these circled up Socratic conversations every day. It needs to be the culture of the school. And I want to end real briefly with this quote by James Baldwin. He mentions his 1963 speech, A Talk to Teachers, when he says, it is not really, I'm going to substitute, you know what he means. That it's not really a Negro revolution that is upsetting the country. What is upsetting the country is a sense of its own identity. Let's think about this Negro revolution as it pertains to CRT. The people are ruffled, their feathers are ruffled in terms of what's being now, what's attempted to be taught in terms of the actualization and actualities of what has existed for the 400 plus years of people coming to these shores, being brought into these shores, and people trying to talk about the enduring legacies of race, class, gendered issues is a problem for some people, and they can't face it. So once again, Baldwin says, if, for example, one managed to change the curriculum in all the schools so that Negroes learn more about themselves and their real contribution to this culture, you will be liberating not only Negroes, you'd be liberating white people who know nothing about their own history. This is not necessarily about making sure that we edify people who look like me, which is definitely a part of the cloud of the conversation. Let's be full disclosure and fully frank. It's also about edifying all those people who have been left ignorant due to the schooling system. And when we lift one group up, we're going to lift them all up. So when we educate one group of people in an authentic way, with authentic curricula, with comprehensive curricula, with authentic pedagogy, with authentic aesthetics and assessments, by the way, that really measure the learning processes and help support them when they get outside the classroom district and classroom building and district, then we are going to lift up all people. I thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Wow, that was awesome. Thank you all so very, very much for all of those incredible insights and for the wisdom and the experience that you bring to this conversation. We are so grateful that you've been here with us tonight. I'm conscious of the time. We've had a wonderful presentations from all of you, and I want to open up the conversation not only to members of the panel who are encouraged to unmute at this point, but also to invite questions from the audience. If the audience would like to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A, we'll be taking those and sharing them with the whole group. So first of all, I would just want to open it up to the panel and ask you if you have reactions to what someone else said or questions you'd like to ask them to follow up. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question. From each of your perspectives, and you don't have to answer this in any particular order, what do you think are the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities in implementing culturally responsive, sustaining education? And will someone please tell us why we have to have both responsive and sustaining in that phrase? Natalie, I'm going to start with you. You look like you're making a move to talk.
That was a big question, Ann. Challenges. This work requires a redistribution of power. And what does that mean? It means that folks who hold power in this moment, whether it's designing the trajectory of a curriculum unit or setting policy across a school district for whether or not we have remote learning, there has to be a redistribution of that power in decision making, in responsiveness, in how we navigate this current socio-political context. And that means it will be felt a certain way, because systems, this education system that we all operate within, was set up to be hierarchical. And so pushing back against that will require some really sort of tectonic shifts, right, in the plates that are the foundation. The opportunity is we have this opportunity to better serve kids. And I mean, if we can't all agree on that, then some folks probably should not be in education, right? We have an opportunity to curate a different set of conditions that would actually change the lives of how our kids and we move throughout spaces. And that to me feels just particularly poignant, right, as an opportunity. So there are opportunities as a part of this work that we haven't even yet imagined, that won't yet be imagined until we redistribute that power and young folks are able to be the drivers and the agents, right, of their own learning, as Dr. McCutchen offered us. So a lot of challenges and opportunities, and I'll give you like the 30-second conversation about why there's that S after culturally responsive, but I'm sure there are other folks who want to pop in as well. So really taking a look at the work of Jangle Paris and H. Sami Alim, who pushed to build upon the foremothers of the work of culturally relevant education, Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings, to build on this idea that yes, we want to respond to the young folks who are sitting in front of us. And yes, we want to think about representation and how diversifying not just who teaches our kids, but how we teach and what we teach matters greatly to children of all races to combat those biases and stereotypes that are so deeply ingrained in us. But the sustaining element means that the cultures, that the familial and linguistic histories of all of our children, but particularly those from historically excluded groups, are sustained as a way for all of our children to understand there is something different than this whiteness that has always been centered, that we have just come to accept as the only humanity. And if you want the text that I'm sitting with now, textured teaching, I've got it right here on my desk. So shout out to #DisruptText, Lorena Escoto Herman. Also from the framework of culturally responsive and sustaining ed, she's adding all these rich intricacies and layers of how to embed love, radical love, how to think about what sustaining pedagogies look like in the classroom. So highly recommend that if you're looking for something to chew on in this moment.
So we have a couple of questions coming in, and Mark Levine asks, what role can parents play to promote these important changes? And related to that, Leslie Condon asks, I'm not a current educator, but very frustrated by the lack of a culturally responsive curriculum in my children's school. What are ways I can voice or express my concerns thoughtfully and strategically? So again, how can parents play a role in advancing this framework and these ideas in their children's schools and classrooms?
I'll respond as a role I most recently held was president of the PTA Council in New Rochelle. So I had the privilege to learn how to work with parents outside of the building in order to better learn the processes of advocating. So a lot of parents don't necessarily know or have the time, quite frankly, in terms of being on survival mode. And sometimes we rush to judge why parents aren't present and not recognizing the entirety of the context of the parent and the community and the history and the sociological and the psychological effects that have produced that community and produce these contemporary effects. So what needs to happen is, how do we begin to support parents by giving them the opportunity to learn what questions to ask first and foremost in an authentic way. I'm not talking about questions that some people just want the parents to ask. I mean authentic ground level questions in terms of how can students who are furthest from opportunity be supported. So when we can use PTAs, when we can use other parent groups and parent organizations and student-run organizations as well, stakeholders in the community, to begin to learn the processes of the questions to ask. When we can ask the questions, we're halfway there. Now we know who to target. Now we know first, primary, secondary, and tertiary targets upon who we need to change the dynamic and change the paradigm. But unfortunately, some of our parents, because we're in survival mode, and haven't had the opportunity to be given those lessons of what questions to ask. So it would start with me. How do we get parents and students, all stakeholders, how do we give them the opportunity to learn the authentic questions to produce, as Natalie said, that power shift?
I'm going to flip that around a little bit and ask. We invited the people who registered for this event to submit some questions in advance, and a couple of people asked about dealing with hesitancy or resistance from parents who worry that implementing the CRS framework means losing something else they value. So in terms of that redistribution of power or redistribution of resources, perhaps. How would you suggest districts and schools respond to these kinds of concerns? I'm going to give that question to April, if you don't mind, because you touched on that in your presentation.
Sure. And so, just as I showed depicted in that picture of the tree and the apples, right? it's looking at the systems and looking at where the barriers exist and working to change that and take those barriers away. So that doesn't mean you're going to take away from one child to give to another. You're going to look at where the inequities are, and you're going to create systems and structures to fix that inequity. So in the same way that we ensure that, you know, if we have a student that's been identified in special education, we go through our testing process, and then we see what are the needs does this student have or need so that they can be successful. And we have to look at our school systems in that way. When we give those resources to that child who may need additional supports, it didn't mean that we took away from student A to give to student B, right? So we're building it into the system, and that's really what we're looking at. So I'm not sure, every time someone says that, I'm always thinking as, you know, where that comes from, because I've never really seen where we've taken from one kid, it's like, you know, and given to another. If someone comes to school with no lunch, we don't take the student who has lunch and give it to that student who doesn't have lunch. So we can think about it in that way. We create a system or a way to ensure that all the kids can have lunch that day.
Well, but I would say, April, I think when we think about this, we know what it's about, right? It really is, it speaks to what Natalie said in the comments about not necessarily, it's about a loss of privilege, right? That's what it's about, right? And you know, there are folks in our communities, in our society, in our country who benefit from the inequities. And so what we're talking about is that folks want to maintain these inequitable distribution of resources. And so to Natalie's point, which I really want to highlight in the chat, is that those of us, including those of us that are in this space, right, though we have some, though we are oppressed in some ways, or we are marginalized in some ways because of some of our identity markers, there are other ways that we have privilege, right? And we really need to enact that privilege every opportunity that we can. And in particular for white folks, and for many other folks, for instance, that have sponsored today's panel, the Nicoles, the Ants, right? Like those folks are really enacting and using their privilege, stepping up to the plate and talking back to not just the naysayers, but to the haters and to the folks that really want to hoard, they want to hoard the resources. And I think that's, you know, to your point, April, yeah, and I think you know, and we all know what fundamentally it's about. Really, it is about some folks just want to hold on to and gobble up all the resources, and they really don't care about other folks getting access. And that's where we need allies, and we need to enact our privilege. Again, I want to underscore that all of us on this Zoom have a certain degree of privilege. And so in the spaces that we can actually influence, then we need to enact that.
We have a comment in the chat that I think relates to, in part, to a question that was also asked of us. So how do we ask students, or how do we work with students to get them to empathize and understand each other in meaningful ways? How do we build kind of cultures of support, empathy, especially in middle school? I mean, I would invite that question to be answered both by Dawn and by April, both of whom work with that age group of children.
So I think I would just say that part of the work that I think is really important is also addressing the needs of the whole child. And so identity is one part of that, but we are also emotional human beings, and people have feelings. And there needs to be a certain level of trust that is built between educators and students. What often happens is we ask our students to share every part of themselves, and then we share nothing about ourselves. Their trust is not there. Why would they want to if you're not opening yourself up to share who you are? So I think for students, there needs to be that level of trust, and you need to see me and know me, my identities, but also who I am as an emotional human being. and I need to feel nurtured and cared for and loved and supported, and then I can learn, and then I will open up. But it's that level of safety that I think many students may not feel in the classroom. They may not feel that sense of acceptance or belonging. And if you don't have that, then the safety to share who I am is not there. So you can't, I don't think that you can do one of these things without the other. You need to address the whole child.
No, I definitely agree with Dr. DeCosta. I think that, as a former middle school teacher and an administrator in a middle school, it is a holistic approach, but I also know that the curriculums and how the pedagogy, going back to what Al had shared about, agency teaching, giving students that agency and giving them the skill set to be able to have conversations, understand their histories, and Dawn spoke about the joy, Black joy, as well as we learn about the hard histories. We have to also learn about the culture, the great culture that comes out, the resilience of people. So we're not just putting groups of people as only, or seeing them as oppressive people or in oppressive situations. So I think middle school is that age where we're able to teach certain or have certain conversations and learn certain things, and it has to be throughout all the content areas, right? Where the math equations are coming from, who are some of the mathematicians. I remember seeing Hidden Figures as an adult and like saying, wow, if I saw that in middle school or elementary, maybe I would have went into the STEM to see, to understand and see myself in that way. So I think it is holistically, I think it is our curriculum and our instruction. And I think it's also giving students that agency to find their voice.
Well, thank you all. I'm conscious of the time. I wonder, Nicole, where we want to go next.
Well, for me, we would just stay here all night. I know some of you do have to jump off, so I would say that I'm speechless and I'm processing so much tonight, and I feel so grateful for your voices and your brilliance and your generosity, truly. If you have to leave, I would say please do, because I know often you're on to other Zooms and working curriculums for school tomorrow. But if some of you do want to stay, I think we can take a couple of more questions and answer some of the things that came up in the chat. So please, if you're going to leave, please unmute and say goodbye, and just know that we want you back, and we will come and find you. And we're so grateful for you.
So I am going to say good night. I have to go to work in the morning. This has
you.
been so wonderful. So I'm so very grateful, And any way that we can continue the conversation, I would love to do so. Thank you so much to everybody on the panel. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you all so much. I will also head out because I hear my 2-year-old not cooperating for bedtime in the background. It was an honor, and I look forward to all that grows from this space. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Natalie. So we started off with Jountel, and she has been quiet for a while. I wonder, given the history that we talked about here and the sense, this, I'm sort of springing this on you, and this description of what's going on in the present, what makes you hopeful about the future? Is there anything that we're doing now that might actually lead to a meaningful shift?
Yeah, that is a.
Maybe it's unfair to ask just you that question, but I'm wondering now about hope and leaving on a hopeful, constructive note.
Yes. And obviously other panelists as well. Feel free to jump in. I can kick us off. I think what is hopeful about this moment is that there's hindsight is 2020. And I think to the extent that we have the ability to not only know, but to examine deeply our history, and And to kind of the comment about April's comment from seeing hidden figures, for instance, in both an academic, but also in a mainstream way, there's not enough and there's still far to go for us to uncover and unpack. But to the level that today we have been able to have this timeline of stretch of the depth of where we have been and how much possibility there is in our policies, in the ways that we educate, in the frameworks that we institute to kind of name, right, the grounding of our conversation today in terms of the CRSE. These are types of frameworks that is a legacy of good education. In different names, they have been iterated through previous years. What is exciting is that we have those in a collective today to build upon and in ways that folks are actively engaging to connect. I think that's the beauty and I would say difference of today, that at a larger scale, we are seeing that. I mean, just to name, multicultural education was, of the 80s, right? Like a few states really thinking about it generally, not really putting any financial weight behind it, very sort of light touch. And yes, by and large, this is why we still have the conversation. But what is hopeful is that the frameworks today are thinking a bit more holistic and they are at a more systemic level. And so I think that there is hope in that, one, when we have the knowledge, when we have the deeper understanding, when we have the appetite to really connect, to actually push it forward in ways that extend beyond what we have seen historically, is hopeful. So I'm looking forward to the ways that not only CRC in New York, but in other states parallel, right? Like are really beginning to systemically do the work, not say that they are interested, not say that they will implement, not implement and not enact, but also being matched with the appetite at a groundswell level. Having parents on this discussion is an example of that. The ways that folks are really coming together at all stakeholder levels of the education system with an appetite to do so. So historically, there has been greater appetite around the contention against it. Whereas today, I think there's definitely an amplified level to support it. And that is reason for hope.
And I kind of want to jump in there too. I feel from as an educator, but also as an advocate in doing this work, that our system, our United States is based on laws and structures. And I think that a hope, actually an expectation that I have for our legislatures around this topic is to begin to create some type of laws that will ensure the sustainability, because we can talk about what we would like to happen, and we can talk about adopting frameworks, and we can ask districts to reflect and do equity audits, but opting in is not, this is not a time to opt in anymore. This is what we need to do. And I just shared some two bills that are in the legislature right now. One is about ensuring all districts have a chief equity officer, similar to a district clerk. And another is ensuring that we're teaching our histories, especially around Black history, which is a foundation of United States history, that is taught in a way that is culturally responsive, and that it is not, once again, just something that's taught in schools that you see mostly Black and brown students, but it's taught in all of our schools, because that miseducation has led to so much of the implicit bias that we're trying to now train people from. So if we can help young people in schools before they become teachers, before they become police officers, before they become judges, doctors and nurses, then a lot of what we're seeing today, those inequities will, and hopefully, not be there in the future. So I think if we really do both, look at our school systems, but also look at our laws and how our legislature can support and mandate certain things to happen in schools, we can start seeing some change. But if we continually allow this to be an opt-in, then it's going to falter in some ways. It might grow in others, but it's not going to be a systemic change.
Yeah, April, thank you so much for sharing those links to that legislation. I mean, I think to your point, what's really powerful is again, thinking back to the quote that Al shared from James Baldwin's Talk to Teachers, right? Where what you're talking about is actually teaching, right? Not just teaching, folks of color, but teaching everyone. And until we actually disabuse white folks of a notion of the lack of a presence and value and historical contributions of all folks, we're not going to make some of these important changes, right? We can't. It really does start at all levels. So I talked about, you know, higher education and working with, you know, sort of disrupting stuff at the point where I'm teaching aspiring leaders. But fundamentally, those aspiring leaders were children in schools, were kindergartners, were pre-K students all the way through 12th grade and being miseducated around these issues. But I do think in terms of hope, I mean, for me, it's always, it is a real challenge for me, right? Because there's so much that can feel really disheartening. This feels like a really encouraging conversation, and, you know, I could attend a Board of Ed meeting or be watching the news or whatever and feel really disheartened and discouraged. But I think for me, one of the critical pieces is this notion of radical hope and an idea of sort of understanding the historical, sort of where we sit in history, right? To Jountel's earlier points and more recent points. We sit in a particular place in history. And if we look back 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you know, not much has, you know, there are a lot of things that haven't changed, or maybe the changes are somewhat superficial, but there really are some substantive changes, right? And there is, like you said, sort of a groundswell, right? And I do think that, and we understand that this is, we don't want it to stop here, that notion of perspective for me is really understanding that we're at one point in history and we have to play our part. And that we understand that we're standing on the shoulders of the folks that came before us and who fought for rights and access before us. And there are folks that are going to be standing on our shoulders. And that perspective really gives me hope. Yeah.
I'll just say briefly, as an educator in the classroom, the students give me hope. I mean, historically, it's the youth that have always led paradigm changing movements. And that's no different today. What's different and what extends and what allows that hope to be extended and hopefully actualized is social media. So students are asking questions. They've always asked questions, but social media is now allowing them to produce those questions and produce the construction of knowledge in different spaces that far expand what they're traditionally been allowed to do so. So if they're not being allowed to express it in the classroom, which we're going to try to change that as well, they're going to go right on social media and express it there, and with a farther reach. So, and with a greater idea of some type of redress to happen if you go viral, for example. So what's inspiring me is the young people who are on the Zoom tonight, making statements, asking questions. Young people who will be in our classrooms, who are in our presence, asking questions, who are forcing us to answer them. And when we don't answer them, they go right to social media and respond and get responses from there. And that's what's inspiring to me and giving me hope. The young people and the mechanism for social media.
That gives me hope, Al, because I'm one of those moms that just cries at night in her pillow wishing there was no social media. But I think that, you know, the thought of using it to empower each other and to promote change is really very hopeful. There was a comment, and I think it speaks to everything that both Rosa and April were saying, as well as everyone on the panel, but looks like a student, Alexandria, was saying that, you know, she has seen, I want to go back to it so I don't paraphrase. I agree with Mrs. Taylor. As a student, I've witnessed many sheltered and uneducated peers use Black history, especially to tear down my peers in serious conversations and slurs. Meanwhile, half of them don't know what they're referencing or speaking on because they weren't taught our personal histories in school or at home. So I think a lot of it is, you know, building this culture where when we understand the gravity of who we are and this construct that was created for us, based in oppression, I think our kids can carry that weight. And yeah, sure, it could make them uncomfortable for a little bit, but I also think it's going to empower them. And it's going to, I think, greatly cut back on those moments when we're hurting each other with words and ideas that our children really don't understand because of the way that they're taught. So that's hopeful for me to know that when we get deeper, it can get messy, but it also, I think, comes out on the other end as a more united community of young people. So, Anne, is there anything else floating around in the chats or the
No,
Q&A.
I think that, obviously we could go on and on all night, but I want to respect our panelists' time and our audience. And, I'm heartened by the fact that so many of you want to continue this conversation, perhaps in another time and place. And I think it was really great. And I appreciate everyone's honesty and their humanity and their contributions. And I look forward to talking with all of you again.
Yes,
Thank you.
we're so grateful for your time and generosity. We will have you all back in one way or another. And to our audience, thank you for sitting with us tonight, learning with us. And that's it. Please, I'll look for the follow-up resource email so that we can put the links that were put in the chat, and just all the things that our panelists discuss, we will feed you so that you have that to learn from as you go further. Thank you so much.
CURE relies for its work on donations from wonderful people. So we don't mind if you go to learnwithcure.com and make a small donation to support our work.
All right. Well, good night, everyone. Thank you,
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having
Good
us.
night, everyone.
Okay.